welcome you back to what happens to be our 192nd episode of ThinkTech Hawaii's Humane Architecture. And we're on our continued search for a more in line with our beautiful natural environment, more light built environment on the island. We're broadcasting live with me, your host Martin Despang, near Munich, Germany, back to Tucson, Arizona, in the Rob Paulus studio, and we have our utmost expert in that area, Tarzan Larry Medlin, back in Tucson. Hi, Larry.
Hi, Martin. It's nice to be with you. I've enjoyed these shows.
Me too. And this is going to conclude our Volume 9 series of Larry's Wait Late Lust. And let's jump right into the recapping what we did last week. We were talking about that you elevated your tensile tensegrity into the realm of mass dwelling, and then also venturing into the ecological. And so this is also our Earth Day, because this is the Earth Day week. So this is our Earth Day show here. Let's go to the next slide and talk about, we left with Frei Otto's, your friend and mentor and colleagues, most prominent ecological project in my home country of Germany, in the Tiergarten. And this is worth, as we said, another show that we will do in the future. And you will talk about your friend and collaborator Herman Kindl, who had a big impact in the project, right?
That's correct. He was the co-architect, and he was the one on site that worked and coordinated the residents and the people that were living in there.
Yeah, absolutely. And let's go to the next slide, because this is coming back home to your original native home, the United States, where you had been parallel, as Frei had been continuing in Germany and elsewhere. You basically continued on the ecological path as well. And let's share what you've been doing back in Tucson, Arizona, what we see here, Larry.
That's what was called the Solar Oasis at the Environmental Research Lab. And that was where the efficient use of land, water, energy, and impact upon air quality and food production was a primary topic that we explored and experimented with in these various projects. And this is looking into the area underneath the skin, which is the skin in that case is a chain link mesh that has a vine that's deciduous. So it lets sunlight through more densely in the winter when you want it that way, and it provides full shading. But also tying with the ideas of food production and stuff, it's an experimental place for trying different kinds of food vines and so forth.
Yeah, when I was on the phone with your friend Jürgen Hennecke the other day, he remembered that chain-link fence you guys used.
Well, and that was done like many of the things that you've done, working with students. So that and that we actually we found to be able to be stable enough. We could get chain link made in a 1 inch by 1 inch grid instead of a 2 inch by 2 inch grid. So it's a lot more stable. And that was sky blue coated, which sort of helped it disappear somewhat when you looked up.
Oh, that's great. We need that for our collaborative Primitiva 3, Larry. And you also have something that we also have in Hawaii, which we see at the bottom right, which is called the EARL, which is the Environmental Research Lab, right? And let's look at explain a little bit what we see on the bottom right, which we call the Clearview collector, right?
Yeah, that's the Clearview window wall collector that consists of sheets of glass, sliding glass doors on the inside at about 8 inches back, another row of sliding glass. And in between it is a Venetian, a thin blind that's painted a dark brown or black on one side and white on the other. So when you want to reflect sunlight, it's turned out to reflect. But then at certain times, you turn the black out. And when the sun comes in, it becomes a solar collector. And you can either vent the air directly into that space, or as we did on a couple of projects, into a rock bed for storage later. But the other process by which that works is when you're rapidly cooling, which is an overpressurized system, you have to have an outlet to the outside. So you simply let it go out through this Clearview wall into the outside. So what that does, it creates an exterior window in the summer that's cooler than your body temperature, and you're radiating to it, and instead of vice versa. And also in the winter, it's warmer than you, and so it's radiating and providing heat to you.
Yeah, and it's also potentially using something that works in our more mild and less subtropical tropics of Hawaii, which is evaporative cooling, right?
Right. It was also applied to the centrum space, a big space at the University of Arizona, covering a main space, allowing it to change and sort of respond in different ways from season to season.
Yeah, and very timely to put this into the perspective of politics. This was under the great support of the Carter administration. And as we've been talking before with DeSoto and Ron Lindgren, we think the Biden administration is picking up where Carter has left. And this week is also the week of the Biden and Harris administration's World Climate Summit tomorrow and the day after tomorrow that we look much forward to. And talking sort of celebrities, both from politics and the private businesses and the show industry in Hollywood supporting your guys' work. Let's go to the next slide, and remember that gentleman up there on the left.
That's Marlon Brando, who is a big fan of the environment. And behind him is Carl Hodges, who is the founding director of the Environmental Research Lab and also the creative initiator and developer of the Seawater Farms concept later in his life. Unfortunately, he just died on the 6th of this month. I'll talk a little bit more about him later. And what they're looking at is an idea for the solar oasis, which we did and we saw in the slides on the lower left below, that was showing that you could, in the middle of the summer, create a cool and comfortable environment for foods to grow and people to observe exhibits and so forth. And that was an early concept idea for how it could be expanded to a more permanent one. And the purpose of that was to deal with the whole idea about global warming. The idea was to replace a parking garage and put a big garden space in its place, and then leave a little bit of the area for an oasis-like things to surround it. So that basically it was an effort to deal with the urban heat island effect by both absorbing carbon dioxide and generating energy through plants and so forth, to be able to cool the space, make it more pleasant to be occupied, and also set up some opportunities for logical food and plant development.
Yeah, and your collaboration with Carl, Larry, is very much in line with the very collaborative nature of your mentor and friend, Frei Otto, who always collaborated with people. And you didn't stay just home in Tucson, but you used your hot arid expertise to venture out to another part of the world. And that gets us to the next slide. And this is in Eritrea, right?
Right. This is also the project that Carl Hodges developed. It's in Eritrea. Carl and I traveled there on Y2K day. We left Phoenix, and we were able to get a plane safely and securely and arrive there on the 2nd. And this had been the first of the Seawater Farm projects. And the purpose for a seawater farm is, through a canal of seawater, you move it inland to serve as a supply of seawater for shrimp, fish, tilapia mainly, and mollusks. And then the seawater filled with sea life excrement is then used to fertilize surrounding fields on which saltwater tolerant plants called halophytes are grown. One of the most famous ones, sort of equivalent to soy and the other plant area. Salicornia is a plant that has a high protein food source. It has oil that can be used as biodiesel, and it was also, it's edible for human beings. If you take off the tips of it, it's very tasty when you use it in salads and other vegetable dishes.
Yeah, and as we see on this slide, you were providing essential shade once again. And as you told me, you know, with found materials, with stuff that these mats that they were doing, and you were, you know, basically basing your further design. And as you do in the ERDL, you know, and ERL, you do real scale prototyping, right? As we see here, trial and error.
Right, and in fact, as I mentioned, this was the first weeks of the Eritrea project. So this was not only a test of being able to provide a halo shot around the edge of shrimp ponds. They had 80 shrimp ponds that were 10 meters in diameter and 1 meter deep. And so this provided shade around the perimeter, or it provided an area of shade around the perimeter, always in one area where the shrimp could swim to be shaded, and workers could be there to feed them and attend them and so forth.
Yeah.
So this shows me working literally. The point I wanted to make this is that lightweight structures, some of them are very technical, look very complicated, and have industrialized fabrication methods, but they also can be, this was literally almost handmade. This is a process where we used found materials and taught local labor how to make this, which was a test structure that served as a prototype for the 80 shrimp pond covers later. And then later that lasted for several years and was very successful in shrimp production and export to Europe.
Yeah. And if you want to know more about the project, it's published, as we quote up there, in your the Architecture and Overseas Chinese and Overseas Architecture magazine. That all your other great projects are featured in there, and there's also a great CNN coverage about, you know, Carl's work. And let's go to the next slide, which is basically illustrating much about what you already talked about. And there's a link to another. So there's great coverage on there, out there in the web, that you should follow these links. And the bottom picture is slowly but surely transitioning us back to Hawaii, because these are mangroves, right? They play an essential role in that whole project, right?
They were also used in Eritrea. The seawater flows, you know, you pump it uphill through a canal and then let it flow back to the sea. And the last spot it goes is through the mangrove swamps and fertilizes that. It helps them grow, establish a base to the shoreline of the project.
Mm-hmm. And it also in some ways reminds you of your upbringing in Florida, right? And some of the vegetation there, and like the banyan trees that we also have in Hawaii, right?
Yeah, well, we also had mangrove-like plants there too.
Exactly. And that gets us to the next slide, which is the emerging generation basically in Hawaii, in jungleizing and exploring the so amazing natural environment to learn from for the built environment potentially. And the question, why can't we build anywhere close to? And you know, you with your research, you get as close to that both with the tensegrity and your ecological approach. But wrapping up, we also want to look at this because not just because of the pragmatics and the science that we explore and its logic, but also because of its inherent beauty, it's the poetics of it that are obviously, you know, powered by, you know, it making sense. And so let's revisit a couple of the slides from the past and go to the next one. And look at it differently. Just look at it, how beautiful it is, right? And you know, we explained all the logic behind, but let's just enjoy it for, you know, how pleasing it is to the eye and actually all senses, right, Larry?
That was the pavilion project that we were doing at Washington University in St. Louis. And you can see there, you know, we were studying about how you could take a fabric membrane and actually torque it or twist it and make it come down from a roof room to have more of a lateral or sidewall enclosure. And those are two components, but at the same time, they are designed to be an interesting element and so forth in a campus fine art show that was held in that campus, that area.
Yeah, and go to the next slide. Expanding on that one again, there is this, you know, the same principles of nature. We see the trees around it. There's this sort of porosity to it, right? So there's a certain density, a certain opacity, but then there's a certain, you know, openness to it, and it provides shade while allows the sun and the wind to come through. So it is not trying to mimic nature, because you can't, because nature is the master, right? But it tries to learn from nature and try to do, you know, as good as you can as, you know, as a human spider, what you guys were when you were doing that, right?
On the right that's the project where we discovered by working with soap films, the possibility of a high-low eye loop. And on the top right is the model, which we then, as I mentioned previously, hand measured for patterns and so forth, and then the built structure on the right. That was the one that we also had the discussion about being used in another way for the train station in downtown Stuttgart later.
Yeah, exactly. And more impressions of that, again, next slide. We all saw these before, but we just want to revisit them and look, you know, at the poetry of them as much as the pragmatism. And another one of these is the next one, the most prominent one, because we talked about this one before. Next slide, please. This is your initial one that, you know, you trial and error one when Frei told you not to use a drill, and you did, and you tore it apart, but you know, you rebuild it again, and here it is, and share that someone reached out to you from that, sort of looking at the poetics of it. Who was that?
Well, that was a gentleman. We built this, and Frei Otto and I specifically discussed it. You know, we don't want to just demonstrate the principle of this structure. We want it to be an elegant and an appropriate form. And so I studied a whole bunch after I destroyed that one by accident. I built a whole series of smaller models and then evolved it into this one. And Frei Otto was an outstanding photographer. He took these pictures while I was literally standing underneath them, just sort of. He said, no, a little bit up on the right. So I had it on my back so I could tilt left or right to bring it into the position. And then a gentleman from the German government came in and said, what are you doing? And we showed him the model, and we showed him these photographs, which sort of, not only is it a model that you're looking down at, but also something you look like you can walk through. And he got very excited. And that's when he invited Frei Otto to join the competition for the German Pavilion in Montreal, which, as we know, we won and got to do and collaborate with Rolf Goodbroth in Stuttgart.
Yeah, and that was proactively, and sort of, you know, retrospectively, there was this art historian reaching out to you and saying, I want to showcase this as a piece of art, which it is as well, right?
That's correct. A young woman from Leipzig saw that it's now on the property of the German Architecture Museum in Frankfurt, and it's been on tour several times. And she saw it somewhere on his European tour, and she didn't realize it had anything to do with structures. She just thought it was a beautiful piece of fabric sculpture, and that's what she was interested in. You know, she asked me a lot about how did you get such neat details, and how did you determine the proportions, and so I just had an ongoing conversation with her about some of the things that we've just been talking about.
Yeah, and go to the next slide, because then you were both, you with your SpaceNet project we shared in the last show, and Frei very early in his Berlin Bauhausian box was thinking about how can you inhabit that, right? How can human beings inhabit these kind of space nets? And here is this very intriguing early sketch that again has a lot to do with actually the Olympic Village that was built by other architects behind Lewisha and Partner, while their approach is the same, of having basically solar oriented housing, large lanais as we call them, as we call the balconies in Hawaii. But the nature of the beast is different. The Olympics is stereotomic and heavy, precast concrete, as we referenced to the respective shows at the bottom left. But Frei's and your way is the area, is the lightweight way. So the question was, how do you make that happen? And we can see here, you know, all these great efforts to basically recognize the challenges of temperate climates and winter gardens, and, you know, that are breathable with awning windows and jalousies, try to make that work. But there's a certain inherent conflict between the climate and the culture of these ideas, right? And so maybe,
Martin, the purpose of this sort of illustration was to show that was to provide for each of the dwellers in that space net dwelling an opportunity to interact constructively with the climate of the environment in which it was located, and to also learn and help children learn, and everybody, you know, begin to value nature and natural systems in a much more understanding way.
Exactly. And let's slowly but surely go back to where we want to continue these studies to a climate that is way more conducive of being outdoors. And that's the next slide that gets us back to Hawaii. And you pointed out there's a fellow collaborator of your guys who actually ended up residing there, right? Talk about him.
Yeah, that's Conrad Roland, who actually wrote a book called Spanwein about Frei Otto. It's published in German and English. It's an excellent book. It was one of the first books that shows, his early projects and details. It's really well designed and written and very informative. So I'd certainly recommend it. And then he did some theoretical studies for more abstract forms like the tower that you see in the right and so forth. But then he got the idea and he tried to use it as a climbing structure for children. And that became an absolute sensation. He sold those all over Europe and then all over other parts of the world and so forth. And that's what actually provided him the means to retire on Kona Island in Hawaii.
And we have to say he also unfortunately left us last year. But his legacy is alive and talking. He's your neighbor in the German Architectural Museum in Frankfurt that you mentioned, where your project is, and where also this fantastic tower is that has been in a box for decades, and it was rediscovered, and they donated it to that one. Let's go to the next slide, because this is showing one of his playground climbing structures in this phenomenal way of what Bundet Kanistakon likes to call an open system. That's not scripted where they have to be. That's always in motion and always dynamic, and sort of exemplifies the sort of potential of urban nomadism. And let's go to the next slide, because this gets us to the project that we have currently going on together, Larry, with the emerging generation. And you see there a Zoom screenshot of one of our sessions that you were part of, and basically coaching and going back to these initial sketches that Frei did in that Berlin Bauhausian box where you met, where you took him up on his offer to visit. And this is what Tropicare Rockwood was digging out and was bugging me and saying, why don't you make this an assignment for one of the tree texture class? And so we're working on this as a potential proletarian people power tower building. And that gets us to the next slide. And this is just showing snapshots of the way we work. We're here in Munich. So I basically took you guys to the 72 Olympics by Frei, and we're going up close and look at the details. And we have also been using your shows, Larry, as a waking viewing assignment and listening assignment to coach us. And at the bottom are just sort of, and this is all a work in progress, and it needs way more development. And you're continuously giving great recommendations and encouragement for the processing of that. Right?
It's a very nice image in the right, the computer rendering there that shows the idea of a coherent system that comes up with a main mast and collects them, and the implication that it's got biology and living elements around it. It's a very good start.
Yeah, and you challenge us because of prototyping. One of the things we want to pass on as an additional assignment is the working title is Smoking Good, right? What is that about? What did you suggest? What do you suggest? How to test its performance?
Well, the thing is that your point is that air will blow through it and you accept it. That was like what in the back of that Frei Otto slide, the outside edges, every resident could open and interact with the climate. And then you also plan to have a thermal draft tower that goes all the way right through this so that air can move through it. But those are relatively complex systems. And if those work or don't work, you don't just say that's the idea. You've got to build a model and do a test. And that's where you can use dry ice and make a chamber that's 6 feet by 8 feet by 10 feet or something like that, and build forms like that and study how, with a fan pushing it, air moves through something like this, and try it with different combinations of openings and so forth. The other issues, and that was what in the case study we did, that you can't be just pure structure. You've got to have emergency fire stairs and elevator towers and all the things that allow you to live in something. So that's one of the challenges of you've got all these discrete water, in fact, the circulation system, the safety ingress and egress system, the airflow and ventilation system, the social culture continuity system that you express as, a key conceptual idea in this. And all of these need to be looked at. And my recommendation would be, isolate each of those sort of major issues, do some studies, and then step back and begin to see how you could integrate some of those alternatives together in a logical way.
So gang, this is the assignment of the week by our coach, Larry. Thank you. And we're really shooting high here for actually having the ambitious idea to actually spiraling up all the way with the floors and questioning the, conventions of, horizontal calibrated floors and also their nature. That's why I'm saying, when you talked about the tighter density of the netting, we're actually shooting for an open and aerated floors, and that's all to be further developed and prototyped, as we said. Larry, we do the last slide, which is basically phasing out and thanking you for these very inspirational shows. And there are more to come. Here and there we talked, there has to be one about your friend Konrad Wachsmann. There needs to be one about the Olympics in '72. There needs to be one about Hodges more, right? And there's so many more. So we will have you back, but we let you off the hook for a little bit to catch some breath. But we want to close with this one here, coming back to where we started, because when people want to know more, you welcome them to basically reach out to you and stop by at your home in Tucson, Arizona, and where you have all these physical manifestos, right, from the Institute and also from Frei and such. And so you guys, whenever you want to stop by and reach out to Larry, then do it through me, shoot me an email, and then I will forward it to you, Larry. And then, that way we continue the discourse and the discussion.
That's fine. On the right, that's just some of the typical examples of the IL publications. They still are very active in publishing things. The Institute for Lightweight Structures at the University of Stuttgart. And I would encourage people that are interested in more detail about these things and past research projects to go and look and see what's available that way. I want to say one last thing about Carl Hodges. The name is Carl N. Hodges. And if you go and look on the website, you'll find all kinds of videos about him that in quite detail talk about his issues of, wanting to deal with climate change and the issues of adequate food production for the world and so forth. And if spending some time looking at, there's 5 or 6 immediate ones that you can find. And I would really encourage people to check out some of those.
Okay, and I want to, on a last note, I want to say here is the legendary marble table again that we all know from the previous shows. And if you haven't watched them, this is the reason to watch them again. Okay, Larry, thanks so much for the exciting, adventure together. I much appreciate it. Have a good break, and then look forward to have you back soon. And until then, stay happy and healthy.
Thank you very much, Martin.
And everyone else, until then, stay as Tarzan-y as Larry.